get started this evening. Some others may trickle in on cue, may trickle on in here. But it's about 6:30, and so we'll try to get started on time. I feel like I owe you all an apology because I said we're going to start in the book of Daniel, and there were 6 weeks between when we started and when business meeting was. And here we are getting ready to do Daniel chapter 3. I was wanting to get 6 chapters before business meeting next week. We only made it to Daniel chapter 3. 1 week we had our missionaries that came, so that took one out. 2 weeks we had to cancel because I was in quarantine, and then our COVID numbers were up. So here we are. I'm supposed to be all the way in Daniel chapter 6, and we're only in Daniel chapter 3. And we're going to have to take a break next week because we have business meeting. And then we'll have a week or so, and then we're going to take a break because on the 5th Wednesday, we're going to do our night of prayer and worship again. And then hopefully we'll get through Daniel chapter 6 sometime in October. So we'll get there eventually. But for now, we're in Daniel chapter 3. And Daniel chapter 3 is probably the most popular between 3 and 5, 3 and 6. Daniel 3 and Daniel 6 are about the most popular. But when we talk about Daniel chapter 3, we remember 3 fancy names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So how many of you all know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Almost all of us. And so the story's not going to be surprising. It's a little disappointing. I always hope there's someone who goes, I have no clue anything about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because if we could read it for the first time, it's a lot more dramatic. You know, when you know the ending, it almost takes a little something away. And so tonight, we're going to try to do our best to pretend like we don't know how it turns out, even though we all do know how it turns out. So we'll start tonight by kind of reviewing chapter 1 and 2 very quickly, because we are going through the whole book, and chapter 2 especially is going to help us, especially with the beginning of Daniel 3. So chapter 1, what was Daniel chapter 1 about? Does anybody remember? It was about Daniel, yes. Gold star tonight. What about Daniel and his friends? They're taken into captivity, and they're offered, but they refuse what?
King's food.
Right. The king says, have all of this food. We're going to make you big, strong, hopefully wise, and we're going to put you in positions of authority. We don't know exactly what the conflict was there, but for some reason, it broke their convictions, whether it was unclean food, possibly, whether it somehow dehumanized them as Israelites, whether it was sacrifice to idols. What we know is they couldn't, in good conscience, eat the food. And so they abstain from the food. They end up stronger and smarter than all the others that are in the king's court, and they get promoted. And we kind of see this beginning in chapter 1 of people standing up for what is right and God rewarding them. So Daniel chapter 2 is all about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So we're not going to rehash all of chapter 2. You can look at the old video for that if you want to kind of catch up a little bit. But just fast forward to Nebuchadnezzar's actual dream. Does anybody remember what did he dream? What was his dream about? What did he see?
Image.
It was an image, a big, huge statue.
Basically an image.
Yeah. And what was the statue, the image, made out of? Does anybody remember? It had several parts. The head was made out of gold. The arms and the chest were made out of silver. Then the thighs were made out of bronze, right? Yeah. And then the legs were made out of what? Iron. And the feet, if you want to put a fifth layer, the feet were iron mixed with clay, so it wasn't as strong, right? And he sees this image of this pebble or this small stone coming and striking the feet where it's weakest, and the entire thing collapses and falls down. And there's a lot of symbolism in there. We didn't even get to talk about all the details of history, but basically the interpretation is this statue is empires. And the gold head, Nebuchadnezzar liked to hear this, the gold head was Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, right? It's the most precious metal. It's the most expensive metal, the rarest metal. It's the greatest and the best, and Nebuchadnezzar thinks that's great. That middle section of arms and chest of silver. What we learn in history represents the Persian Empire that's coming. We can actually confirm in history that this is Persia. Then you look at the thighs, and we see the Greek Empire of bronze. Now, we're going to get into some details on the Greek Empire that blows our mind, that Daniel could see these dreams and visions of future events that had not happened. Now we read history books, and bam, they're right on cue. That iron represents Rome, and it ends up getting shattered and broken by the pebble. Who is the pebble? It's Christ. He comes, and that pebble that shatters all the empires of the world grows into this giant mountain which never fails. So the lesson of the story, let's rehash the lesson of Daniel chapter 2 is God is in control of history, and he is greater than every other empire. Right? That's the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar needs to take away. That's the lesson that you and I need to take away. That no matter how big we build our empire, how big we build ourselves up, Christ is greater, and he is over all else. That is an important lesson that we should take away as soon as we start reading in Daniel chapter 3. Because in Daniel chapter 3, the very first thing we read with me in verse 1, we learn Nebuchadnezzar's take from this dream. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth was 6 cubits, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. What was Nebuchadnezzar's takeaway from the dream? I'm the gold head, so I'm going to make a gold statue. This is what he pulled from the dream, right? God is all powerful and coming to overcome all things, and your takeaway is, look how golden I am. Right? His statue, though, was different from the one in the vision, right? The vision decreased in wealth as it went down. Not Nebuchadnezzar's statue. It was 60 cubits or 90 feet high and 6 cubits or 9 feet wide, and it was all gold. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar got from his vision was, if there are kingdoms that depreciate in value, someone may come and destroy them, but our kingdom is solid gold and nothing can overcome me and my kingdom. What a horrible application to his dream and his vision. Now, I don't want to be heretical. God is never surprised. But you got to think God's upstairs going, I gave you a dream and someone to interpret it for you. I made it as plain as can be. And this is what you got out of the dream, that you're setting up an image 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. What Nebuchadnezzar is literally saying is, my kingdom is better than the kingdom of my dream and will survive the stone that comes. I'm greater than the God who gave me my dream. Now, we don't know if this image is the image of one of their gods. It's most likely, though, an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself. Most likely because in Babylon they had emperor worship, and he put himself on par with a god. He made an image of his own likeness, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. So Nebuchadnezzar's statue is meant to state his superiority over God himself. We continue reading in verse 2. King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And a herald proclaimed loudly, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, you're to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be immediately cast into the a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Nebuchadnezzar says, I am greater than the God of my dream. I'm more important and I'm more powerful, and all of you must bow down to me.
That's some kind of evidence right there that the statue was of him.
Of him, right. And that's what I believe. I believe this was him saying, you are bowing down to this image because I am all powerful. It's me. I believe that fully. So let me ask you a question. We don't have the same type of thing. We don't have an image of gold of any politician 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. But let's say we had this great image and all of America was told to bow down and worship. What would your response be?
Pardon? What would what?
What would your response be if you were told to worship a giant image of gold of someone else? All right, stay away. That's actually a really, really good application.
Worshiping is going to get me in the blast furnace, as they call it,
Mm-hmm.
rather than refusing.
Absolutely. We're going to hold on to that application, Janet, because that's really good. A really good observation here. Actually, this next set of verses. Stay as far away from that thing as possible, right?
What's, something that's interesting, it might be just a rabbit, is the music
Mm-hmm.
is a part of that worship.
That's right.
And today, what's our music all about? I mean, we have Christian music, but the rest of the world has all this other music, and what? They worship
Absolutely.
Those-
Worship
those are
artists.
idols.
Worship. That's right.
artists and all of this stuff.
You know, I didn't put it in my notes, but it did the same exact thing cross my mind. Worship or music and worship go hand in hand, right? For secular and Christian. For us as well, right? I mean, for Christianity, all through the Psalms and the Old Testament. Yeah, that's a good observation. And here is, it's not just bow down, it is worship. Right? Bow down and worship. I would like to think that we would stand strong, and we would say no, and I really think people of First Baptist Church are good, God-fearing people that we would. However, how did everyone in this culture react? Now, they weren't all good Jewish people. They weren't all Hebrews. They were from all the nations, but certainly they were not all emperor worshipers. They had their own deities, their own gods, their own followings, their own religions. Some of them might have been Jews. Some of them may have been other religions. Verse 7, what does it say? Therefore, as soon as the peoples heard all those instruments, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Most people just worship, no questions asked. And quite honestly, I have a hard time believing there weren't some good Jewish boys in the midst of this group. Now, we're going to read about a few of them that didn't. But how many times do we see, even in our culture, we don't have an image of gold, but we have our own figurative images of gold. Do we see even good Christian people bend and bow to those idols? Let's be really careful that we don't look at these group of people and go, I would never. It would not be me. I'm going to be the hero of this story. And we know full well when the pressure comes and fire is the option, we often bend and end up bowing.
And just think if you were there with your family, because they kind of
That's right.
announced it, everybody shows up. You're there with your family. So what are you going to do? You're going to tell your family, we can't do this? Or we better do this if you want to live.
And that's actually a really good point. How many of us would say, if it were me by myself, I would stand, but I'm not going to let my kids be affected, which is a noble thought, an unbiblical thought, right? A wrong thought, but it is, we can at least understand that there's pressures, right? That it's not just me, it's others as well. And even if it was just me, if I'm going to be all by myself, it's really hard to stand when you're the only one standing. So there's all these reasons to cave. And we see that everyone, other than a few we're about to read about, bow down and worship. We don't, well, according to this verse, they did fall down and worship. Now, did they actually worship? I don't know. And how many of them, Gary, to your point, how many of them said, guys, we're not really going to worship. Get on your knees and close your eyes and pray to your God, right? Is that any less sinful? I mean, you avoid the worship, but then,
It's kind of like that place that we get in where we don't fully trust that God's going to protect us.
that's right.
And so given just that little bit just to kind of appease both sides.
Yeah. And to Gary's point, I think you're right. There probably were a lot who said, just go through the motions. Just do it. Right? You don't actually have to worship. But I believe that's disobedience still, right? Especially when you read the New Testament that says, don't even give the appearance of evil. So yeah, I don't know, Gary. That's a good question. Did they actually worship the image or not? I would argue that it probably didn't matter. That if they went through the motions, they gave the appearance of worship.
They all put their masks on.
I'll take one.
Well, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. Yeah, they all at least bent their knee. So that's tough. I think it reminds us that we come up with reasons and excuses, though, right? Let's just do this, and like you said, maybe be on both sides, so we appease these people, and hopefully we appease God. I don't think God is pleased when we're just trying to appease other people. But let's go on. Let's see what happens then with these young men who are pointed out, starting in verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. By the way, this is one of the funniest verses in this passage. How they approach the king. He's just said, worship me or be thrown into the fire. So they come and they don't go, hey, I got a bone to pick with you, king. They come and they go, oh, king, live forever. This is going to be a stark contrast to how these young Jewish men stand before the king. Oh, king, live forever. You, O king, great and mighty, wonderful, powerful king, you've made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you've appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Notice they call out the certain Jews in verse 12. There are certain Jews who pay no attention to you. You know what's kind of strange to me? Who's missing from this chapter? Daniel's not mentioned. You don't find Daniel in Daniel chapter 3. Honestly, we don't know where he's at. Maybe he was on a task for the king and he wasn't anywhere around. We don't know. Maybe he was not called out because these satraps, prefects, and governors knew that Daniel had been promoted up here and they did not dare challenge Daniel. I doubt this is the case, but maybe Daniel compromised. I don't think it is, but you just don't see him here. But there are certain Jews who are easy to pick on and point out. Now, to Jana's point earlier, I do not believe that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when the trumpets were sounding and everyone was getting ready to bow down and worship, I don't believe they were standing right in front of that image, standing firm with their chest held high, shaking their fists. I think, just like we're going to read Daniel did in chapter 5, they went about their everyday lives in their worship of the one true God. They just did their thing. Too often we want to flaunt our faithfulness. And being confident in our faithfulness is great, but adding to our own temptation, right, by shaking our fist at the culture, usually doesn't bode well. I'm with Jana. If this happened in America, it would probably be in Washington, D.C., and I'm staying put in rural Illinois so that I'm not having a red flag and a target on my back. It's just common sense. The application is don't go where the temptation is the greatest, right? Don't put yourself in a position that would make you have to say, maybe I should bow for the sake of my family. Maybe I should compromise for the sake of my testimony.
I started to say a while ago, when you talked about in the other chapters, by nature, we're naturally nosy.
Mm-hmm.
and we want to go see what's going on.
It's true.
And so possibly some of them,
Right.
weren't over there enough to just go see what was going on.
And once they're there, they're trapped, right? Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes we got to be careful, right? When we go places we shouldn't go because we just want to know what's happening. And then the temptation's the hardest.
And verse 8, you read, you said about the Chaldeans.
Mm-hmm.
My version says astrologers.
Yeah, so the Chaldeans, the word for it can either mean just Babylonians in general, or it can mean specific role of, they were like government religious leaders and they followed the stars, astrology, yeah. So in this case, I think it's referring to these religious people of Babylon.
I think, you related the fact that probably they weren't all commanded to go down to the image.
Right,
But and you just think this is typical of Islam, where they'll have those prayers, they'll start sounding.
whatever time of day,
And wherever they're at, they'll
stop.
spread their little rug out and
Right.
kneel and pray.
Yep. And this is what it was. Wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, you've heard the announcement, but if you're not right here, you're responsible when you know. But these Chaldeans, these astrologers, these religious people, these high up individuals find these three men and they make this accusation. Now, it's easy to look at the situation and compromise. These three men did not, and now it's getting them in trouble. Now, while it might have been difficult to stand strong before, it's about to get a lot harder on them. Because sometimes temptation is out there, and sometimes temptation tattletales on you, grabs you, and brings you right in front of the image. And that's what's about to happen. Look in verses 13 through 15. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Sometimes temptation is there and we can resist it because we don't go where it's toughest. But sometimes temptation grabs you. This particular part of Daniel 3 always makes me think of Genesis 39, 11, and 12, when Joseph is in Potiphar's house and she's making passes at him and he's refusing and refusing, but one day they're home alone, and what does she do? She reaches out and she grabs his cloak. Sometimes temptation is at a distance, and if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes temptation really gets a hold of us. Now, I think the same reaction that Joseph had in Genesis 39 is the reaction we need to take to temptation, and that is run, not walk, run. We don't have to do a deep study in Genesis 39, but we can be reminded that Joseph left that outer garment behind. The implication is that he's streaking through the house in his underwear to get away from this woman, which, by the way, makes him look really bad if she's accusing him of some sexual sin later on. But he was willing to take that accusation to get away from the temptation. You run, you don't walk. And here they're right in front of the statue and right in front of the king and possibly right in front of the fire and the flames. But why do you think Nebuchadnezzar is so mad? It says in verse 13, he had a furious rage. Why is he so upset with these three young men? All right, so there's a disrespect there. I said do this. I'm the king, and you need to do it. Yeah, I think that's part of it. Absolutely.
I think he had kind of sorted them out and put them in positions too. I mean, he had really given them privileges.
So there's another reason, right? Like I've scratched your back, and here you're turning your back on me, right? You challenge my authority after I've done all this for you. Yeah. Yeah, I have given you a life of luxury. I could have left you behind in your homeland where we are demolishing the temple and destroying your cities. I brought you out and gave you a home. You could have been orphans, and here you are, and I've done all this for you. Sure.
Even there in Babylon, they could have been nothing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Given them all kinds
But
of
he's
privileges.
promoted them. Yeah.
I'm sure that when he was told that they were not worshiping him, that there were other people around, so he was probably humiliated as well.
Right? Yeah. So there's a little bit of a how dare someone? Now everybody knows. Maybe if they'd quietly done it, or if nobody else knew about it, or if I didn't have to know about it. But it's more of a public something. Maybe. Yeah, absolutely.
And he might be afraid that somebody else is going to follow.
I got to make an example of these three, because if I don't, who knows who else may rebel in the future? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, and I think that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? Is it's not just that you're usurping my authority, but you're saying I'm not worthy to be worshipped. Now that's a problem. Like, I'm not God, you're saying that I'm not worthy? Jamie?
These 3 men had connection to Daniel, who was the prophet who explained the dream.
Right, absolutely.
So therefore, these are his friends,
Yeah, you guys should know better. This isn't the statue from the dream, remember? This is the gold statue, the one that's going to outlast the pebble, and you guys are buddy-buddy and should know better. All of this enrages him, right? Literally, these 3 young men are saying, you're not worthy to be worshipped. When his ego has said, everyone, everywhere, worship me. Verse 15, this question, and I shared it earlier on Facebook. This is, I don't know that there's a more bold and heretical question that anyone asks in all the Bible. The end of verse 15, after he threatens the fiery furnace, says, and then who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Can you imagine the gall of someone saying that? The mindset they must have been in to say, I am God and no one else can match me. This is a bold and, quite honestly, dangerous question to ask. Who dares challenge Nebuchadnezzar's power? What we find out is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they know a guy. They know the God who is able, and they're about to share that. Their approach to the king, by the way, is much different than the satraps, prefects, governors, and all the officials. Listen to how they approach the king in verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Basically, we don't have to tell you anything. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he'll deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Someone summarize for me their response. Put it in American 2021 language. What are they telling the king here? All right, so they're kind of poking fun a little bit, right? Like, oh, king. That's kind of how I read it. I mean, you get the prefects and governors like, oh, king. But their wording here, it almost sounds like, oh, king, not live forever, but we don't have to answer you. We don't owe you anything. You might have housed us. You might have put us up. You might have given us all of these things. But we don't owe you a dime. We don't owe you an explanation. We don't owe you anything. So part of it is a little bit of mockery, it feels like. How else could you summarize their response? Go ahead, throw us in the fire and see what happens. Yeah. Would this be your response, by the way? I often like to think we'd be the hero of the story, even if I weren't bowing, even if I was going to stay faithful. I'm not sure this is what my conversation would be. I would hope that it would be because of my sarcastic nature. I hope that Lord, give me the strength. But I've been pulled over before for speeding and had to talk to an authoritative figure. And even when I think I'm in the right, I've got all the things in my mind where I go, I'm going to say, and then I roll down the window and I say, this is not my response. Right? You're literally looking at King Nebuchadnezzar and they're going, we don't owe you anything. You're not a God, and our God is able to do any of it. We know the God. We can answer your question because our God is able to save us. He doesn't need any extra miraculous proof. He just is powerful to save. What I love about their response in verse 17 and 18 is they believe in the power of God to save, but they know full well he might not. And this is where I wish we could read it fresh without knowing the outcome. It's at this point that we realize they have a full grasp and understanding that they may be dying in a matter of minutes. There's an absolute refusal to bow. What gives them their confidence, knowing that they may be dying any moment? What gives them their confidence to stand strong and speak this way?
Assurance that God would save them either from the fire or from the eternal
Yeah.
fire.
They were sure that God could save them of the physical fire or that eternal fire. Yeah. Similar, is that what you were saying? Absolute faith, right? We know the answer to the question you asked Nebuchadnezzar. What God? We know that God. They had full confidence, assurance. I like that word, David. We knew, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that God was able to save them from any of those circumstances. There was a faith in who God was, and this is key. To this chapter, this is key. There was a faith in who God was. So they could stand strong, not because of what they've done or what anybody else has done for them, but because of who God is, they could stand strong. And God did not need to save them to prove his faithfulness. Well, this is big. God doesn't have to do the miracle for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to say God is worthy to be worshipped alone. They were able to say, even if we die, we want you to know, King, our God is greater than you. Even if you kill us, if he chooses not to save us, our God's still bigger and greater than you. What this tells me is that our faith in who God is always leads to faithfulness in what we do. The more we know about who God is and what he does through his word and through what he's done in our lives, the more obedient and faithful we are to him. So you ask, why can't I have obedience to stand strong like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Can I tell you in the most simple terms as possible? If you feel like you don't have that kind of faith, be in the word more. When you know more of who God is, your faith will grow. Your obedience will grow. Too often we want all of the heroic Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego obedience. And we don't want to do the work to know the scriptures about who God is. I know I'm a pastor and I'm a dork because I enjoy going to seminary school and classes, and I just really soak up commentaries and things that are boring. And I get that, but can I tell you, theology matters so much. It's so important to know who God is. Because when you know the God, when you can answer Nebuchadnezzar's question, what God can save you, when you know who he is, and you have faith in who he is, your faithfulness explodes. It's their understanding of who God is, their faith in God, that he can save, that leads to their faithfulness, even when God chooses not to. So what happens? Verses 19 through 23. Again, let's pretend like we don't know the final outcome and read what happens. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. Of course, we know why. He's being challenged in every way. The expression on his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now, how did they have measurements? I don't really know. This 7 times literally means 7 is a number for perfection in the Bible. It was heated as hot as it could get, perfectly hot. That's what they're trying to communicate here. You could not get the fire any hotter than it was. He ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Don't overlook that verse, because sometimes we think, why do we have all these details? There's a reason why you know all the clothes and layers they were wearing, and we'll come back to that here in just a minute. Verse 22, because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell, bound into the fiery furnace.
That furnace must have been just glowing from the heat.
I don't know what these furnaces look like, and maybe Clint may have done better study than I have. I can't help but get VeggieTales in my mind when I think of this scene, and I know that's horrible, but I just picture this huge, almost bowl of glowing fire, flames bursting, and in my mind, they're walking a plank like they do in VeggieTales, hopping because they don't have feet, I guess. I don't know, maybe they're bound, and jumping into this. And I don't know if that's what it is or not, but imagine a bowl of fiery fury. Glowing, you're right, of just so hot. But what were the consequences of Nebuchadnezzar's urgent command? His mighty men, right? It wasn't just get a couple of guards to take him. No, where's my strongest men in the army? They're going to be the ones to go in because they're the only ones who can handle this heat. But what happens to them?
Even they got
They die. Right. Yeah, go ahead.
He also could have been destructive.
Yeah,
I mean, he thought these three men were, destructive.
kicking and fighting and screaming.
He wanted someone who could control it.
That's probably right. Yeah, so we're going to send these strong men to bind you and throw you in. And if you kick and scream, you're not stronger than these guys. How about this irony? Nebuchadnezzar's whole premise is, I'm greater than God. I'm greater than the almighty dream giver. But what we see is he's not able to offer protection of his servants the way God is able to offer protection of his servants. Who's greater now? I'm fast forwarding to the end. We already know what the end is, but we sit here and we look at it and we see the irony of Nebuchadnezzar saying, look how great I am, when he's sacrificing his men for his own cause, and God is sacrificing himself for his servant's cause.
This guy evidently didn't really know about that.
Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about that at the end of the chapter, even when he praises him, what his attitude may be. And of course, the rest of the book we'll find. So this isn't the end of the story. This isn't where we end, and we would read more here in just a minute. But I think it's important to take note of this. If we're reading this fresh, have you ever read a book, and I'm not an avid reader, maybe it's a movie because I've done it to a movie, but have you ever read a book and you get to a certain point and you're so disgusted with where it's going, you slam it shut and you throw it away? I've done this to movies before where I'm just done with this movie. I'm not watching it anymore. Can you imagine if you're like a new Christian, never knowing anything about the Bible, and you come to this and this great God, and you read this verse, and they're thrown into the fire? I would imagine there's some people who are just so disgusted, they close it and they throw it away, and they're mad about the ending. Here's what's important for us to know.
If not there, then a couple chapters later when they have Daniel being thrown in.
Right, yeah, and this could happen again in the lion's den, right? And so you read some things like this, you get so frustrated maybe, and you can shake your fist at God. Of course, we know this isn't where the story ends, but here's what's important to know. For some people, this is where their story ends, right? Some people get thrown into the fire, and they physically don't make it out. David said, God's able to save from the fire, physical fire now or the eternal flame later. And yes, we praise God that they're saved from the eternal flame later, but we're still scratching our heads on why the story would end here for some people. Right? I think it's important not to read Daniel chapter 3 and assume that God always puts a nice bow on everything. Absolutely.
So, had God allowed them to die in the fire, they would have continued to worship him.
They would have. Yeah.
So, God had to prove to him that he wasn't.
And I think that's, so I'm going to rephrase what you said because I think you're right. God did prove to him. But I'm going to rephrase it and say, not that God had to prove. Because that was all of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's point is, God doesn't have to prove anything to you either. You can keep worshiping these false gods as long as you want to, It doesn't change the fact that I'm greater than you, right? And so God uses it for that purpose. My point is, sometimes God chooses another route to show his glory. Sometimes it's not proving by a miracle. Sometimes the story ends badly. How would this story be different if it ended right here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's death? How would it be different? Right? So what you said just a minute ago, with their continual worship of the idol. Nebuchadnezzar would say, see, your God couldn't save me. Absolutely. All right, how about this? How would the story stay the same if it ended in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's death? God is still all powerful.
Well, the fourth man that was in there that looked like God,
Yep.
and then they ended up dying.
Well,
There was a
there's a presence of God still there with them in their death even. Yeah. And that's the whole point of the story is God is still in this picture, right? God is still almighty. If this is where it ended, it doesn't change the fact that God is with his people and he is greater than Nebuchadnezzar or any other kingdom. It's really important. I think that Daniel wants us to know that when he writes this. And I think that's why it's included. Even if he doesn't, we won't bow. Because we want to think that God is always going to do the miraculous. And when he doesn't, our faith can be shaken, or we can still say God is still on his throne. God is still good, and God is still all powerful. God is able, and God is faithful regardless of the outcome. Even when things are poor. And why can we say that? Because our faith in who God is not determined by the circumstances of the world. Of course, that's not where the story ends. It has a happy ending. So, new Christians who are watching this, let's read on to verse 24 and through 27. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of these men. Not a hair on their heads, the hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. So whenever you think that's a throwaway verse that says, look at all these clothing they had when they were thrown into the fire, it's not a throwaway verse. It's to prove that even when you get near a fire, you smell like smoke. And when you stand in the fire and come out not smelling like smoke, God's hand was on you, right? There's verse 25. David mentioned it earlier. There's a 4th in the fire, and he looks like a son of the gods. This is most likely Jesus Christ himself in the Old Testament. I believe that fully. I think a lot of Christians also teach and believe that. It definitely represents, whether it was Christ or an angel or whatever it may be, it definitely represents God's presence with his people.
That was something they really couldn't explain. They threw 3 in and 3 came out, and yet they saw 4.
And yet they saw a 4th. And that 4th looked like a son of the gods. They knew he looks different from normal humanity, right? Where'd he go?
At that point, he's still not claiming they're God,
No.
you know.
Wait, we're going to get there. So look at verse 26. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Here we go. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. How does this phrase reflect a change in Nebuchadnezzar's attitude?
I suppose he got scared.
Who before was the Most High God, according to Nebuchadnezzar? He was.
So he's recognizing that there's someone more powerful than him.
That's right. And he's terrified, right, Merle? He's scared to death because there's someone like a son of the gods. who's more powerful than I am.
What are you gonna do with me now?
There's a recognition that there is someone greater than Nebuchadnezzar, which is, it's not a small thing. But let me ask you this. Is there a confession, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the only God?
No.
Sadly enough, we never see this confession from Nebuchadnezzar. Not here or anywhere else that I can think of in the book of Daniel. How often are we able to say, God, you can be elevated, but you can't be the only? God, I trust you, and I'm going to come to church and worship and do all the good things, but there's some other things that are really important to me too that, okay, aren't as high as you, but they're important, and I can't let go of them, right? Nebuchadnezzar calls out, and it is telling that he understands that he is not all powerful, but he still is not recognizing God as the only. We already talked about in verse 27 that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego aren't even affected by the fire. They're not even affected by the flames. God's hand is so great. I've got a lot more notes here, but for time's sake, I want to move on to the last few verses, verses 28 through 30. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies, rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. God ultimately works so that he gets the glory and is glorified. Nebuchadnezzar is now able to say, there is one greater. There is one greater than me. So why did God save the young men? So that he would receive glory. That's the answer to that question. Not because they were great or powerful or anything about them. God receives glory because of his work. Had he not saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, why might God not choose to save them? Same answer. Because somehow or another, God would receive the glory. We need to understand that when God works, it's always so that people can understand his glory. So sometimes he saves, so we go, God is amazing and awesome, and I need to fall down and worship him. Sometimes he doesn't save because somehow or another it's going to draw people to worship and know more about him. So according to verse 29, we've got just a couple of questions and we'll wrap up with some application. What is Nebuchadnezzar's view toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Look at verse 29. What is his commitment now? How does he worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? That's right. It's almost this fear thing that Merle talked about a minute ago, right? Let's not anger this God. You're not putting that anger on me. If my people that I know of are going to anger this God, I'm going to make sure it's not on my conscience, right? I don't even have this in my notes, but just reading this again. Who is Nebuchadnezzar giving the power to in this worship here? Himself again, right? If you don't act this way towards this God, I'm going to act this way on you. It's almost as if he's going, God may be great in a lot of ways, but I'm still going to be the one yielding the punishment and the control.
It's a hidden meeting. You can't tell from outside if there's anybody in the building.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So we have then Nebuchadnezzar still trying to flex his muscles. God is all powerful, but he's not alone. Nebuchadnezzar says, I still have some power as well. Is this genuine worship for people then to fall down and worship God if they're going to be torn limb from limb if they don't, and their house is laid ruin? And this isn't the only time in history this has happened. As a matter of fact, shortly after Christ, a couple of 100 years after, the Roman Empire had been just terribly persecuting Christians and believers until they finally get a certain emperor who converts to Christian faith and commands it's the official religion of the Roman Empire. And you think, finally, God's name is going to get spread. And it does for a time. But what ends up happening is people don't worship because it's genuine. People worship because they're forced. We end up...
In these verses, is he saying that they have to worship God, or is he just saying that anyone who
Yeah.
speaks against
Don't speak ill of. You're right.
They're
Yeah.
not saying that. He's not saying they have to worship him.
No, just definitely don't make him mad. Because I'm sure in the Babylonian culture, you make a god mad and you're smite, right? So just don't upset him. And if you do, don't put my name to it. I'm going to make sure this God knows.
He may be afraid that they'll get burned too.
There's a fear there, right? That's what we were talking about earlier, right? There's terror. This isn't worship. This is fear. But there is at least a change of heart. God is seen as great and almighty. God is seen as superior to the nations. Several applications and truths, and I've got a bunch. I'm just going to kind of fire through them quickly. We kind of hit on most of them as we went through. One is be careful not to manipulate God's message to promote yourself. Early on, Nebuchadnezzar has the dream. He sees the golden head, and he says, you know what's better than a golden head? A golden statue of myself. We got to be really careful not to take what God reveals to us in his word and make it about us. Secondly, keep temptation at bay by not dwelling where it's strongest. And this is what Janice said. Don't put yourself right in the middle of the strongest place of temptation. If you can remove yourself from the temptation, do so. Go about your life in faithfulness without having to put yourself in tough positions. 3, run, don't walk from temptation. Get as far away as possible. Excuse me. 4, knowing who God is will increase your obedience. That's what we mean when we say faith leads to faithfulness. Knowing who God is gives us confidence to stand for him. 5, God's faithfulness is not tied to circumstances. When it doesn't seem like things are going our way, that does not mean that God is not faithful. God acts or doesn't act in order for people to see and worship him. 6, God may not deliver you from the fire, but he will be with you in the fire. David mentioned the Son of the gods, the one who appears that way, is still with them, even if they die in that moment. An important truth that I wrote down next to this point is God's presence is greater than God's deliverance. Well, it sounds catchy, but we don't really believe that when we're in the fire, right? God, I'd really like the deliverance thing. We have to remind ourselves that his presence is greater than the deliverance. 7th and final application and truth I wrote down. Miracles may lead to a changed attitude toward God, but they will not lead to a true relationship with him. I immediately think of the New Testament when they're demanding Jesus do miracles. Right after he's done several miracles, by the way, if you read the context. He's just done miracles, and they go, show us a sign, and then we'll believe you. He looks at him and says, you're not going to get any miracle except the sign of Jonah, that I'll be in the whale for 3 days and raise again. And really what he's saying is miracles aren't enough for you. When people look and say, God, if you would do this, I would believe in you. I think God looks down and says, no, you wouldn't. Your attitude might change, but I want you to worship me for who I am, not what I do. I want you to have a relationship with me, not treat me like Santa Claus. So we pray and we ask for miracles, but we're reminded that when God does miracles, it's so that we will worship him. And when God doesn't do miracles, it's so that we will worship him. Any thoughts or comments tonight on Daniel chapter 3 as we kind of wrap up?
And people like miracles until they like the next miracle.
That's right. Because when their faith is in the miracles, it never satisfies, right? This reminds me a little bit of our Sunday night Bible study, right? We were talking about Sunday night. It's very similar to what you just said. Whatever is set before us, the things that God provides us with, we always need more of it. When we know who is with us, the presence of God, he's forever going to satisfy. It's a really, really great point. Other thoughts, comments?
If anybody wants to get in more to Daniel, I read a book about a year or two ago, finished it finally. Takes me a while to finish the book.
Same.
David Jeremiah, Agents of Babylon. It's really good.
I'll have to look into that. I've not read that one. David Jeremiah is a great, I know him more as a speaker than an author, but he's great at both. You said Agents of Babylon, is that?
Yes.
Other thoughts, comments tonight? Good. I want to pray for us, and then I'll get our live stream turned off, and we can spend some time sharing some prayer requests. Father, we thank you for your presence with us. God, we ask your forgiveness because so many times we want to see you work instead of see you. And so, Father, we pray tonight that we would be content with the fact that you are with us. Lord, we do pray, and in a moment we're going to share requests. Pray that you would move in miraculous ways. We know you can. Lord, let us have the confidence of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to say, I know my God can do this. And let us have the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to say, but even if he doesn't, we know God is still great. Father, forgive us where we fail you in this. Lord, help us to be faithful to pursue you and your presence above all else. We love you and we thank you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, give me just a second. I'll get this turned off. And then we'll... Maybe. It's erased. My tablet's not doing well. There we go. Oh, so close. Almost had it. You know what? We're just going to mute this.